I watched my 12-year-old daughter tremble as the lemon blueberry cake she spent 48 hours baking slid into the kitchen trash can. The room of wealthy political donors fell dead silent. My father wiped his hands on a silk napkin and declared that such cheap things had no place on his table. In that suffocating quiet, I did not cry. I simply decided to destroy his entire life. Hello to the wonderful listeners of Daisy Revenge Stories. Our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. But if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can afford their living expenses and continue creating for you. You can help us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the video description or comments. My name is Quinn Howard, and this is my story. I am 38 years old, and I make a living by making nightmares disappear. As a senior crisis communications director at Aegis Vanguard Strategies, I spend my days scrubbing the darkest sins of politicians, executives, and celebrities from the public eye. I know exactly how to craft a narrative, how to spin a disaster, and how to bury the ugly truth under a mountain of carefully curated lies. I have stared down scandals that would ruin dynasties and negotiated with the most ruthless power players in the country. Yet, none of my professional coldness, none of the armor I wear every single day, could have prepared me for the quiet, suffocating cruelty waiting inside my own family. My true center of gravity, the only pure thing in my life, is my daughter, Harper. She is 12 years old, a gentle, empathetic soul who still sees the world in the bright, hopeful colors that I lost sight of long ago. The backdrop for this particular tragedy was the sprawling, immaculate estate of my father, Arthur Sterling. The mansion sat like an impenetrable fortress in the wealthiest, most exclusive suburb of Boston, serving as a monument to old money, rigid hierarchies, and cold ambition. My father is a real estate billionaire, a man who views every relationship as a transaction and every human interaction as a calculated power play. Recently, he had thrown the full, terrifying weight of his fortune into running for the governor's seat of Massachusetts. His entire political campaign hinged on a meticulously fabricated, hollow image. To the public, he was the ultimate family man, a folksy pillar of traditional values who cherished his loved ones above all else. Harper, in her boundless innocence, wanted to contribute to his success in the only way she knew how. She spent her entire weekend hunched over our kitchen counter, her small hands dusted with flour, meticulously kneading dough and whisking batter until her arms ached. She was baking a lemon blueberry cake. It was the only flavor I had ever heard my father vaguely compliment during a fleeting, likely accidental, moment of warmth years ago. Harper baked the layers to absolute perfection, carefully frosting them with a delicate vanilla buttercream on top. Using slightly wobbly but deeply earnest lettering, she piped out the words, "Best Grandpa." It was a labor of pure, unadulterated love, a delicate offering from a child desperate for the approval of a man made entirely of stone. The dinner party was a high-stakes affair, a crucial gathering of his most prominent political donors and influential power brokers. The dining room was suffocatingly opulent, dripping with the light of crystal chandeliers and drowning in the heavy scent of expensive perfumes, aged wine, and roasted duck. The air felt thick, saturated with polite, empty laughter and calculated, strategic conversations. When it was finally time for dessert, Harper nervously pushed through the heavy wooden swinging doors of the kitchen, carrying the cake on a heavy silver platter. Her eyes were shining with nervous anticipation, her small chest swelling with immense pride as she walked toward the head of the table. The room quieted down as the wealthy guests turned their heads to look at the sweet, endearing spectacle. Arthur did not smile. He did not soften. His eyes locked onto the homemade cake, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. He stood up from his hand-carved mahogany chair, his posture rigid and commanding. He walked over to Harper, took the silver platter from her small, trembling hands without uttering a single word of thanks, and bypassed the long dining table entirely. We all watched in a state of suspended animation, breathless. As he marched straight into the kitchen, he stepped heavily on the pedal of the stainless steel trash can, the lid popping open with a sharp, violent metallic clang. Without a fraction of a moment of hesitation, he tilted the platter, the cake, Harper's 48 hours of devotion and love, tumbled unceremoniously into the garbage. He returned to the dining room a moment later, his face a flawless mask of aristocratic disdain. He pulled a pristine silk napkin from his tailored suit pocket and slowly, deliberately, wiped his hands, dragging the expensive fabric across his fingers as if he had just touched something unbearably foul and diseased. He looked down at Harper, then swept his cold, dead gaze across the silent guests. "Cheap things like this have no place on my table," he said, his deep voice slicing through the heavy stillness like a serrated blade. The atmosphere turned into solid ice. The heavy silence became a physical weight pressing down on my chest, threatening to crush the breath out of me. My mother, Eleanor, immediately looked down at her porcelain plate, nervously smoothing an imaginary wrinkle on the pristine white tablecloth. My younger brother, Vance, suddenly found the rim of his crystal wine glass deeply fascinating. Refusing to make eye contact with anyone, they were fully complicit in their cowardly silence, instinctively prioritizing the preservation of Arthur's fragile ego and flawless public facade over a little girl's completely broken heart. Harper stood frozen in the center of the grand room, her small shoulders hitched, and thick tears immediately welled in her bright eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks in silent streams. But she did not dare make a sound. She already knew the darkest, most unwritten rule of the Sterling household. You do not inconvenience Arthur Sterling with your pain. Arthur stood by the head of the long dining table, his shoulders squared, exuding the dark, suffocating energy of a predator who had just marked his territory. He thrived on the chaotic emotional outbursts of the women in his life, viewing their frantic tears as the ultimate validation of his absolute authority. I saw his chest expand beneath his tailored suit, bracing for the hysterical sobbing or the fragile, trembling pleas he was so accustomed to extracting from his own wife and subordinates. He wanted me to beg for his forgiveness, to frantically apologize for disrupting his immaculate political dinner with an inconvenient display of childhood affection. Instead, I gave him absolutely nothing of the sort. I moved with a deliberate, haunting slowness that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. I knelt gracefully onto the plush Persian rug, the heavy silk of my evening gown pooling around my legs, and pulled a pristine tissue from my silver clutch. With a feather-light touch, I wiped the damp trails from Harper's flushed, burning cheeks. I looked deep into her frightened, beautiful eyes and gave her a single, reassuring nod. Then, I stood up to my full height. I did not scream. I did not throw a crystal glass across the room. I simply looked directly into the cold, calculating eyes of Arthur Sterling, and I smiled. It was not a smile of surrender or forgiveness. It was the exact, predatory curvature of the lips I reserved for the executive boardrooms of Aegis Vanguard Strategies, right before I dismantled a rival corporate entity or fed an opposing politician to the vicious wolves of the national media. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a chilling, hollow exposure of teeth that signaled the absolute end of peace. "Come along, Harper," I said, my voice as smooth and undisturbed as the surface of a frozen lake in the dead of winter. "It is time for us to go home." I did not utter a single verbal threat. I did not demand a hollow apology that would mean nothing anyway. I simply laced my fingers securely through my daughter's small, clammy hand and turned my back on the most powerful man in the state. As we walked toward the grand oak doors of the massive foyer, I could feel the suffocating silence of the wealthy guests parting for us like a startled, confused flock of birds. Over my shoulder, I caught a final fleeting glimpse of Arthur. He was actually smirking. He lifted his heavy glass of expensive scotch to his lips, utterly radiating with the arrogant satisfaction of a patriarch who firmly believed his daughter had just submitted to her proper, quiet place. He truly thought I was retreating in pathetic defeat. He had absolutely no idea I was simply stepping off the battlefield to arm a nuclear warhead. The drive back to our townhouse in the city was wrapped in a heavy velvet darkness. The tires of my sedan hummed quietly against the smooth asphalt of the highway, the rhythmic sound broken only by Harper's jagged, suppressed breathing in the passenger seat. She had been staring out the tinted window at the passing streetlights for 20 solid minutes before she finally found the courage to speak into the quiet space. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking with a raw vulnerability that physically tore at my ribcage. "Did I do something wrong? Was I bad?" I pulled the car over instantly. I threw the heavy vehicle into park right there on the gravel shoulder of the empty road, unbuckled my seatbelt in a flash, and leaned across the center console to pull her small, trembling frame into my arms. I held her with a fierce, animalistic desperation, burying my face in her soft hair, breathing in the sweet scent of vanilla and sugar that still clung to her clothes. "Listen to me right now," I said, making sure my voice carried the absolute, undeniable weight of truth. "You did absolutely nothing wrong. What you made was a masterpiece. It was created with pure love and kindness, which are two things that man will never, ever understand in his entire miserable life. Do you hear me?" She nodded against my shoulder, a small, shuddering breath escaping her parted lips. "Your grandfather," I continued, pulling back just enough to look fiercely into her tear-stained eyes, "is a man who only understands things that come with a massive, exorbitant price tag. He only respects what costs a fortune. So, I promise you this right here and now. Starting tonight, he is going to learn the true devastating value of expensive things." By midnight, Harper was finally asleep, her small body exhausted from the sheer emotional toll of the evening. I retreated to my home office, a sleek, minimalist sanctuary lined with soundproof glass walls and filled with the faint, sterile blue glow of 3 large computer monitors. I poured myself 2 fingers of neat bourbon, sat down heavily in my leather ergonomic chair, and logged into my highly secured, encrypted server. The wealthy donors at the dinner party, the journalists fawning over his campaign, even my own brother, they all saw Arthur as a self-made, untouchable titan. What none of them knew, what the general public remained blissfully, completely ignorant of, was the absolute truth behind his political rise. Aegis Vanguard Strategies was not just a consulting firm casually hired by his campaign committee. We were the entire structural foundation of his run for governor. For the past 24 months, I had been the invisible, tireless architect constructing his flawless public persona. I was the one who buried the severe environmental violations from his luxury housing developments deep in the bureaucratic red tape. I was the one who ruthlessly silenced the disgruntled, ruined contractors he had bankrupted on a whim. I was the one who paid off the aggressive tabloid reporters and drafted the ironclad non-disclosure agreements when his explosive, abusive temper flared up against his domestic staff. Every single article praising his dedication to traditional family values. Every meticulously scripted television speech about community and integrity had been drafted, polished, and strategically planted by my hand-picked team. I was the sole keeper of his darkest, ugliest secrets. I was the heavy iron lid holding down the boiling cauldron of his inevitable ruin. Arthur thought he was completely untouchable because his offshore bank accounts possessed more zeros than a mortal man could ever count. But I knew the twisted psychology of a malignant narcissist better than anyone alive. Attacking his financial empire would only make him angry, and he would simply hire an army of lawyers to drag out the fight for a decade, to truly break him, to make him bleed in the only way that mattered. I had to sever his life support. I had to strip away the pristine, golden reputation he worshipped above all earthly things. He craved the adoration of the masses. He needed the spotlight to validate his existence. I was going to turn that spotlight into an interrogation lamp. I opened my encrypted communication terminal, the secure network routed through international servers that could never be traced back to my personal IP address. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a brief, heavy second, I thought of the devastating look of rejection on my daughter's face. The hesitation vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, burning clarity. My keystrokes turned into a rapid, aggressive rhythm in the quiet room. I began drafting the classified directives to my elite crisis management team. The instructions I typed were cold, precise, and ruthlessly absolute. There would be no more frantic, late-night scrambling to protect his image. I was preparing to dismantle the very fortress I had spent 2 long years building around him, brick by heavy brick. This slaughter was not going to be loud, messy, or emotional. It was going to be a surgical, systematic, and completely invisible dismantling of his entire legacy. At exactly 6 o'clock the following morning, before the sun even had a chance to pierce through the heavy Boston fog, I executed the first phase of my operation. I sat at my glass desk, my fingers hovering over the enter key for a fraction of a second before bringing it down with a decisive click. An official digitally signed document was dispatched simultaneously to the Sterling campaign headquarters, the State Election Commission, and the Board of Directors at Aegis Vanguard Strategies. It was my formal resignation as the Chief Strategic Advisor for Arthur Sterling's gubernatorial run. The stated reason was brief, legally unassailable, and dripping with corporate irony. The document cited an irreconcilable family conflict of interest. The moment that email left my outbox, I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed the direct line to my crisis management war room. My lead analysts, a team of 20 ruthless public relations mercenaries who monitored the internet 24 hours a day, were waiting for my orders for 2 years. They had operated what we called the media firewall. It was a massive, highly sophisticated digital shield consisting of automated suppression algorithms, kill switch agreements with major publication editors, and rapid response legal threats that buried any negative search results about my father before they could ever reach the front page of a search engine. "Drop the shield," I ordered my lead analyst, my voice echoing coldly in the empty sanctuary of my office. "Cancel all active suppression directives. Release the holds on the opposition research. Do not respond to a single media inquiry regarding the Sterling campaign, effective immediately. Aegis Vanguard is completely blind and deaf to Arthur Sterling." I watched the live analytics dashboard on my central monitor. The glowing green nodes that represented our active defense protocols flickered and rapidly turned red, shutting down one by one across the grid. The fortress was gone. I had just opened the massive gates and invited the barbarians inside. It took exactly 45 minutes for my personal cell phone to ring. The caller ID flashed with my father's private number. I let it ring 4 times, letting the tension stretch tight, before answering and putting him on speakerphone. "What kind of childish tantrum is this, Quinn?" Arthur barked, his heavy baritone voice vibrating through the small speaker. He did not sound afraid, only massively inconvenienced. "I just received an alert from my campaign manager saying your entire division went completely dark. Are you seriously throwing a professional fit over a silly prank with a cake? Grow up. You are a grown woman, not a sulking teenager." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling an immense, dangerous calm wash over me. "It is not a tantrum, Arthur. It is a formal severing of our professional relationship. I am no longer your shield." He let out a harsh, barking laugh that grated against my ears. "Do you honestly think you are irreplaceable? I have more money than God. Quinn, by noon today, I can hire 10 different public relations firms that are twice as aggressive as your little boutique agency. You are cutting off your own nose to spite your face." "You can certainly try to hire them," I replied smoothly, the velvet-wrapped blade in my voice finally unsheathing. "But I highly recommend you have your general counsel actually read the master service agreement you signed 2 years ago, specifically Section 4, Paragraph 12. There was a sudden, sharp silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as his massive ego collided with my meticulous foresight. "What did you do?" he demanded, the arrogant edge in his voice slipping just a fraction of an inch. "I installed a proprietary data lock," I explained with bright, terrifying politeness. "All digital assets, media contacts, suppression algorithms, and crisis protocol databases created by Aegis Vanguard are strictly classified as proprietary intellectual property. In the event of a sudden contract termination, there is a legally binding, non-negotiable 60-day freeze on all data transfers. We do not have to hand over a single password, contact list, or defense strategy to any incoming agency for 2 full months. I paused, letting the mathematical reality of his situation crash over him. The general election was exactly 8 weeks away. You are entering the most critical sprint of your entire political career, Arthur, and you are completely locked out of your own media infrastructure. Your new agencies will have to start building your defense from absolute scratch, which takes a minimum of 6 months. By the time they even figure out who to call to kill a bad story, you will already be bleeding out on the front page of every newspaper in New England. You little vicious. I ended the call. I did not need to hear his rage. I needed the public to hear it. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the blood in the water had attracted the sharks. Without my team aggressively burying the negative stories, the tabloids and opposition bloggers immediately sensed the sudden, inexplicable absence of the sterling media firewall. The leaks began as a slow trickle before erupting into a violent flood. An independent journalist published a verified account from a former landscaping contractor whom Arthur had brutally cursed out and refused to pay over a minor dispute. An hour later, a local newspaper dropped an explosive interview with a former housekeeper detailing his terrifying, explosive temper behind closed doors. The pristine, untouchable aura of the ultimate family man was rapidly dissolving into a portrait of an abusive, tyrannical elitist. The internet was catching fire, and there was absolutely no one left to hold the fire extinguisher. While the political empire of Arthur Sterling began to choke on its own toxic exhaust, I was focused on cultivating life. That evening, I drove Harper to the Culinary Arts District downtown. I had spent a small fortune enrolling her in an exclusive, high-end professional baking masterclass, an intensive program usually reserved for adult pastry chefs training for fine dining restaurants. When we walked into the pristine stainless steel commercial kitchen, the rich, buttery aroma of roasting almonds and melting chocolate instantly enveloped us. Harper put on a crisp white chef coat, her eyes widening with genuine wonder as the head instructor, a renowned French master baker, handed her a personalized set of professional tools. There was no pressure here. There were no arrogant billionaires waiting to judge her worth. As I stood by the glass door watching her carefully temper dark chocolate, a soft, genuine smile finally returned to her face. I had completely isolated her from the suffocating toxicity of my family. She was safe, she was thriving, and she was entirely oblivious to the absolute slaughter I was unleashing upon the man who had dared to break her heart. Within 72 hours of my departure, the internal tracking polls for the Sterling campaign went into a catastrophic freefall. The working-class voters of Massachusetts were reading the leaked stories about his explosive temper, and his approval ratings plummeted by 14 points in a single week. The carefully constructed illusion of the benevolent family patriarch was evaporating into thin air. Arthur was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always resort to desperate, filthy tactics. Since he could no longer rely on my strategic brilliance to cover his tracks, he decided to orchestrate a sickeningly manufactured public relations stunt of his own. The venue he chose for this disgusting theater was the annual charity bake sale at Harper's private middle school. I was downtown in a deposition, believing my daughter was perfectly safe surrounded by her teachers and classmates. I was horribly wrong. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a black luxury van pulled up to the school courtyard. Out stepped Arthur, flanked by my mother, Eleanor, and a fully equipped, professional camera crew. My father was not carrying a humble homemade apology. He was holding a massive, 4-tier masterpiece of spun sugar and imported vanilla bean, ordered from the most obnoxiously expensive bakery in the elite district of Boston. It was a cake that easily cost $800, a gaudy, towering monument to his belief that money could buy absolution and alter reality. The cameras began rolling the second he stepped onto the campus greens. Arthur plastered on a sickeningly sweet, sorrowful expression, transforming himself into the heartbroken, misunderstood grandfather. He approached Harper's small table, where she was proudly displaying her own modest cookies. The heavy lenses of the camera zoomed in on his face as he knelt down to her eye level, a physical position I had never seen him assume in my entire 38 years of existence. "Oh, my sweet Harper," Arthur crooned, his voice dripping with rehearsed, syrupy affection. "I felt absolutely terrible about that clumsy accident at the dinner party, when I accidentally bumped the counter and your beautiful cake fell into the trash. My heart just broke into a million pieces. I brought this to make it up to you, my darling." He reached out, wrapping his large arms around her small shoulders, attempting to pull her into a tight, highly photogenic embrace. He wanted the perfect, tearful reconciliation shot for the evening news, a visual weapon to silence his critics and prove his innocence. He severely underestimated the steel in my daughter's spine. Harper did not melt into his arms. She did not politely accept the lie to save him from embarrassment in front of her peers. Instead, she planted her feet, placed her hands flat against his expensive wool suit, and shoved herself backward with a sudden, fierce strength. She looked directly into his face, completely ignoring the flashing lenses and the gasps of the surrounding parents. "You did not accidentally drop it," Harper said, her young voice ringing out loud and crystal clear across the quiet courtyard. "You threw it in the trash on purpose and you called it a cheap thing. You are a liar." The color drained completely from Arthur's face. The charming facade shattered into a million jagged pieces, replaced for a fraction of a second by pure, unadulterated rage before he realized the cameras were still recording his every micro-expression. He abruptly stood up, gestured frantically to his hired crew, and fled the school grounds with Eleanor trailing nervously behind him like a frightened shadow. However, by 6 o'clock that evening, the narrative had been entirely rewritten. I sat in my dimly lit living room, watching the trending video on my tablet. Arthur's bargain basement replacements in his new public relations department had violently butchered the raw footage. They had shamelessly edited out Harper's rejection. They muted the audio right after his fake apology, cutting the frame away just before she pushed him. In place of the brutal truth, they inserted a slow-motion shot of him leaning in, heavily filtered with a warm golden hue and overlaid with manipulative, swelling acoustic guitar music. The caption attached to the viral post read that Arthur Sterling was a victim of vicious political rumors, proving his sterling character by making amends with his beloved family after a simple, unfortunate misunderstanding. The comment section was rapidly flooding with thousands of gullible voters praising his humility, his grace, and his dedication to his grandchild. Any other mother would have thrown the tablet across the room in a blind, screaming rage. I did not even blink. I watched the fabricated video loop 3 times, analyzing the blatant manipulation, measuring the sheer, staggering arrogance it took to pull such a stunt. Arthur truly thought he had won. He firmly believed he could use my 12-year-old daughter as a human shield to absorb the shrapnel of his collapsing campaign. A cold, dangerous calm settled deep into my bones, freezing my veins. I was not angry. Anger is a messy, undisciplined emotion that leads to sloppy mistakes. I was perfectly, brilliantly lucid. He had just played his final, desperate card, completely unaware that he had walked right onto the tripwire I had meticulously laid for him. The trap was locked. The audience was watching, and it was finally time to execute the unblockable, lethal blow. Arthur Sterling possessed a fatal flaw that I always knew would eventually orchestrate his complete and utter ruin. He was a man obsessed with absolute control, demanding to monitor every square inch of his environment. 2 years prior, when I first took over his security and public relations infrastructure, he insisted on installing a state-of-the-art, voice-activated smart home system throughout his entire sprawling estate. He wanted the ability to lock doors, dim lights, and summon his staff with a mere flick of his vocal cords. What my father failed to understand about modern digital architecture is that a microphone designed to listen for commands is a microphone that is always listening. It is constantly buffering, constantly recording the ambient noise of the room, and continuously uploading those encrypted audio logs to a secure centralized cloud server for diagnostic purposes. I was the one who hired the private contractors to build that invisible digital panopticon. I was the one who generated the master encryption keys, and most importantly, when I officially resigned from his campaign, I deliberately neglected to revoke my own covert administrator access, sitting in the dead silence of my home office. I bypassed his network security protocols with zero resistance. The entire system welcomed me back like an old friend. I navigated through the labyrinth of digital archives, sorting through thousands of hours of useless, mundane recordings, until I found the exact date and the precise timestamp of our disastrous dinner party. It was 8:45 in the evening. I slipped on my heavy noise-canceling headphones, took a deep, steadying breath, and pressed play. The audio fidelity was terrifyingly crisp. Through the headphones, I could hear the faint, sophisticated hum of the dining room, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the low murmur of wealthy political donors. Then, I heard the heavy, distinct squeak of the swinging kitchen doors. I heard my father's heavy, authoritative footsteps marching across the hardwood floor. I closed my eyes as the violent, metallic crash of the stainless steel trash can pedal echoed through my skull, followed immediately by the dull, wet thud of my daughter's beautiful cake hitting the garbage bag. And then came his voice. It was a pristine, high-definition recording of his true, rotting soul, completely stripped of any charming public relations filters. "Cheap things like this have no place on my table." The recording played, his tone dripping with a venomous, aristocratic disgust. It was the smoking gun. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of his monstrosity. But a true crisis manager knows that pulling the trigger yourself often leaves you covered in the blood and the political fallout. I was not going to give Arthur the satisfaction of framing this as a bitter, vindictive family feud. I needed this to be an objective, catastrophic execution. I meticulously packaged the raw, unedited audio file. I did not stop there. I bundled it with the complete digital forensics of the fabricated school courtyard video from earlier that week. I included the raw camera files, the editing software logs, and the exact time codes, proving exactly where his new team had maliciously scrubbed out Harper's voice and spliced in the emotional acoustic music. I compiled this devastating digital warhead, encrypted the entire folder, and routed it through 3 international proxy servers to completely mask my digital footprint. I did not send it to a random journalist. I dropped the file directly into the secure, anonymous inbox of the campaign director for Arthur's fiercest political opponent, a ruthless, veteran senator who had been trailing in the polls and was absolutely starving for a miracle. I did not need to leave a note. I knew exactly what they would do with it. The explosion occurred precisely at 6 o'clock the following morning. It did not just make the local news, it detonated like a thermonuclear bomb across every single national television network and digital media platform in the country. I sat at my kitchen counter, drinking a cup of black coffee, watching the morning broadcast seamlessly transition into a state of absolute chaos. The rival campaign had purchased massive blocks of emergency airtime. They played the sickeningly sweet, heavily edited video of Arthur hugging Harper at the bake sale, and then, the screen suddenly cut to pitch black. Over the darkness, they blasted the pristine, stolen audio recording from the dinner party, the brutal clatter of the trash can, the cold, unforgiving insult. The juxtaposition was entirely lethal. The image of the wholesome, misunderstood family man disintegrated into ash within a matter of minutes. The hypocrisy was so naked, so intensely visceral, that the public backlash was instantaneous and completely feral. Social media platforms were paralyzed by the sheer volume of outrage. The working-class voters he had so desperately tried to court were violently repulsed by the undeniable proof of his elitist cruelty. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the financial hemorrhaging began. Money is a notoriously cowardly entity. The massive super-political action committees that had funded his entire run immediately started pulling their endorsements. The heavy-hitting donors, the very same cowards who had sat at that dining table in absolute silence while my daughter cried, rapidly released carefully drafted public statements expressing their deep shock and profound disappointment. They pretended they had not been there. They scattered like terrified rats fleeing a sinking, burning ship. Millions of dollars in campaign pledges simply evaporated into thin air before lunchtime. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors of my private office swung violently open, shattering the quiet sanctuary of my workspace. My younger brother, Vance, stormed into the room. His designer suit was heavily wrinkled, his tie hung loose, and his face was flushed with a messy, erratic cocktail of blind panic and desperate rage. He slammed his sweaty palms down onto the surface of my glass desk, leaning over me like a rabid dog. "I am going to completely destroy you. Quinn." Vance spat, his voice trembling so hard it cracked. "I just got off the phone with the legal team. We are drafting federal charges right now. Cyber terrorism, illegal wiretapping, grand larceny of proprietary data. You are going to spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary for leaking that audio. You vicious traitor." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly took a sip of my sparkling water, set the cold glass down on a coaster, and tapped a sequence of keys on my mechanical keyboard. I reached out and calmly turned my secondary monitor around so the screen faced him directly. "Before you call the federal authorities to arrest me, Vance, you might want to carefully review this piece of media," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. On the glowing screen played a crisp, black-and-white security video feed from the internal campaign finance office. The timestamp in the corner read 3 weeks ago, precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning. The footage clearly showed Vance sitting entirely alone at the chief financial officer's desk. He was sweating profusely, glancing nervously at the door as his hands frantically typed on the computer, manually authorizing a series of untraceable wire transfers from the campaign donation pool into a private offshore shell company. $350,000, I stated softly, letting the massive number hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "Embezzled directly from your own father's political war chest to secretly cover your massive, embarrassing gambling debts at the high roller tables in Atlantic City. I have the bank routing numbers, the IP address logs, and a crystal clear, high-definition shot of your panicked face committing federal wire fraud." All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet, gray ash. His jaw went completely slack. The aggressive, threatening tough guy act evaporated in a split second, leaving only a terrified, pathetic little boy standing in a massive puddle of his own ruin. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. "If you ever threaten me again, or if you ever dare to speak Harper's name out loud for the rest of your miserable life, I will forward this entire unredacted file to the Federal Election Commission and the Internal Revenue Service before you can even reach the elevator lobby," I whispered, leaning forward in my leather chair, my eyes locking onto his terrified soul. "Now, get out of my office." Vance stumbled backward, hitting the doorframe with his shoulder, and ran. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, leaving me alone in the quiet, absolute triumph of the silence. The final execution took place on a Tuesday evening, broadcast live to millions of households across the entire state. It was the highly anticipated gubernatorial debate, held in a grand civic auditorium heavily guarded by state police. Arthur stood behind his wooden podium, looking visibly aged. His skin carried a sickly gray pallor under the harsh studio lights, a stark contrast to his usual vibrant confidence. He had spent the last 5 days bleeding out in the press, but he arrogantly believed his silver tongue could still salvage the wreckage. He was desperately, catastrophically wrong. Exactly 60 minutes into the 90-minute broadcast, the lead moderator, a veteran political journalist with absolutely zero tolerance for spin, shifted the topic to character and public trust. She looked directly into the camera, then turned her piercing gaze to Arthur. asking him to explain the massive discrepancy between his family man persona and the brutal, leaked audio recording regarding a cheap cake. That was the exact moment the dam broke. The suffocating pressure of his collapsing empire, combined with the sheer, unadulterated narcissistic injury of being publicly challenged by a woman on live television, completely short-circuited his brain. Right there, in front of a live audience of 2,000 people and millions of viewers at home. Arthur Sterling completely lost his mind. His face turned a dangerous, pulsating shade of crimson. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white, leaning forward as his voice rose to a frantic, spit-flying yell. "I am surrounded by incompetents and vicious traitors," Arthur screamed into the microphone, his polished veneer shattering into invisible dust. "You are all trying to ruin a 50-year legacy over a baked good." She was a clumsy, overly emotional 12-year-old girl who made a mess of a high-stakes professional dinner. "I was simply maintaining the standard of excellence that this state desperately needs to survive. None of you pathetic people understand the heavy burden of greatness." A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the live studio audience. The silence that followed was deafening. He had just blamed his own preteen granddaughter for his monstrous behavior on national television. He had unmasked himself entirely. In a matter of 45 seconds, he had taken a shovel and dug the final, inescapable grave for his political career. The debate was effectively over, and so was his life as a powerful public figure. My cell phone rang at exactly midnight. I was sitting quietly on my apartment balcony, enjoying the cool night breeze and the distant city lights. I knew exactly who was calling. I accepted the call but remained perfectly silent. "Quinn," Arthur crooned into the receiver, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling rasp. The arrogant billionaire was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, ruined old man begging for a life raft. "Please, I am bleeding out here. The party committee is forcing me to drop out of the race tomorrow morning. My stock prices are cratering. My investors are fleeing. I need you to come back to the firm. Name your salary. 2 million, 5 million, 10 million. Just come back and fix this nightmare. Save whatever dignity I have left." I looked up at the quiet, shining stars hovering over the city skyline. I felt absolutely nothing for the man on the other end of the line. There was no anger left, no sorrow, just a profound, liberating emptiness. "The price to buy this family back is too expensive for you, Arthur," I said quietly, my voice steady, cold, and completely resolved. I did not wait for his response. I ended the call, immediately blocked his private number, and permanently erased him from our lives. While the Sterling Empire crumbled into dust and ash over the next 3 months, my daughter was busy building something incredibly beautiful. Harper entered the annual Boston Junior Culinary Championship, a highly competitive citywide baking tournament. She spent weeks practicing in her professional kitchen, her confidence blooming brightly with every successful pastry and perfectly tempered chocolate. On the day of the finals, she made a profound choice. She chose to bake the exact same dessert she had made for that disastrous dinner party. It was a flawless, multi-layered lemon blueberry cake, frosted with a delicate, perfectly smooth vanilla buttercream. However, there was a massive difference this time. There was no desperate plea for affection piped onto the top. There was no sweet message for a grandfather who could never love her. Instead, placed gently beside her masterpiece on the pristine judge's table, was a small, elegant placard displaying the name of her creation. She called it True Value. When the head judge announced her name as the first-place winner, the grand auditorium erupted in genuine, roaring applause. Harper stood on the brightly lit stage, holding her heavy gold medal, her face glowing with absolute radiance and unshakable pride. I stood in the back of the crowded room, hot tears of pure joy streaming down my face. At that exact moment, I realized the ultimate truth about motherhood and survival. The best way to protect our children is not to build massive walls to shield them from every possible pain. The greatest protection is teaching them exactly how to walk through the fire, how to rise magnificently from the ashes. and how to prove to the toxic people of the world that our self-worth can never, ever be bought. To all the wonderful listeners of Daisy Revenge Stories, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my journey today. I would love to know exactly where you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments section. If you found today's story engaging and meaningful, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now or use the donation link located in the description or the comments section. Your generosity helps pay the dedicated staff who work hard to bring you these stories, allowing them to feed their families and continue creating better and more exciting content to serve you. Thank you for standing with us.